Amy. Good afternoon, everybody. Today's topic is bramble pruning. I've got my email up on there, and Amy's going to make this available with a link to the presentation at the end when this is all done. I just have to update a couple slides and things, but if you do have questions, contact your county agents, or if you can't get a hold of them, feel free to contact me, but your county agent is going to be your first contact for most questions. I am going to try and distinguish here during this presentation about different recommendations for home gardeners versus commercial gardeners. Things that we would typically recommend for commercial people, we might not recommend for home gardeners, and vice versa. Also have a Facebook page for the horticulture program. I'm based over here in Breathitt County, so if you're interested in what's going on there, you can check out my Facebook page as well. A little bit just talking about bramble, sometimes referred to as caneberries. They are in the genus Rubus in the rose family. They grow from perennial crowns and roots, but the canes are biennials. That means they live for 2 years and then die. One unique thing about some brambles is that some will produce fruit on the 1-year-old canes, and so that enables us to do some unique pruning and things. But the first cane that comes up out of the ground, if you were starting with a new planting, you planted it last fall, and this was the first year canes were coming up out of the ground. The canes that would be coming up this year would be called Primocanes. And then the second year cane, it would grow through 2021, it would overwinter into 2022, and then that cane would change from a primocane to a floricane. The cold weather triggers the initiation of floral buds, which then produce fruit and things. Typically, we're talking about raspberries and blackberries, again, for commercial growers. There are a lot of interspecific hybrids between raspberries, blackberries, and other things out there that have been developed over the years as they've worked on breeding characteristics, things like boysenberries, loganberries, youngberries, all these other things. We don't recommend those for commercial growers. They tend to have a lot of the Western trailing blackberry genetics in them, which makes them much less winter hardy. As a home gardener, if you wanted to try some of these unusual type of berries and things, you can certainly do that. Just be aware that you're going to probably have more challenges with overwintering them as well. But that's one of the advantages to being a home gardener. You can invest for $20 and not be out a lot. But commercially, really, we recommend people are sticking to raspberries, blackberries. And even though this isn't specifically about brambles, overall, I do want to throw out the topic here that brambles do have some challenges now that we didn't have to deal with before the spotted winged Drosophila became an issue here in Kentucky. It's an insect. We had native fruit flies that had egg-laying ovipositors that were like hypodermic needles that had to have damaged fruit to lay their eggs in. This spotted winged Drosophila, Drosophila suzukii, comes from Asia, and it has a serrated ovipositor like a steak knife, and it can cut a slit in the skin of the fruit and lay its eggs in there, which has made commercial production of brambles much more challenging now. So before you get too involved in commercial production, please talk to your county agent, talk to me before you make a big investment in commercial bramble production. Sometimes people confuse the differences between blackberries and raspberries. They are different species. Easiest way to determine that, blackberries, the receptacle inside the berry itself remains when you pick the fruit. That gives you a nice solid fruit. And that way, commercially, blackberries are sold in pints or quarts. Unlike raspberries, when you pull a raspberry fruit off of the cane, the receptacle remains attached to the cane, and so you have basically a cone of drupelets that's hollow in the middle. And that's why raspberries are sold in half-pint containers, because they don't have that receptacle that supports the drupelets, and they crush much easier. So that's the difference between blackberries and raspberries. Blackberries, there's thorny varieties, there's thornless varieties. three main growth habits: erect, semi-erect, and trailing for blackberries. There are Primocane-bearing blackberries now. Dr. John Clark from the University of Arkansas developed the first commercial varieties of these that are out there now. I think there's 4, maybe there's 5 varieties out there now. Typically, most of our blackberries are biennial floricane-bearing. They produce their fruit on the 2-year-old canes. With raspberries, they come in black, red, yellow, purple varieties. They're Primocane-bearing raspberries have been around much longer than Primocane-bearing blackberries, but there's also the floricane-bearing raspberries as well. There is also a Primocane-bearing black raspberry. There's a couple of varieties. Peter Tolman is just a fruit enthusiast from Colorado, did some breeding and has released a couple of varieties of those out there. I trialed his first one, Explorer, when I was working for Ohio State University. He's got another one out there now. I can't remember the name of that one, but I know it's available in the trade. I've seen it in Burpees and Norse Farms and that have a Primocane-bearing black raspberry. We'll talk more about some of the challenges with Primocane versus floricane as we go on here. In terms of winter hardiness, your red raspberries are going to be your most winter hardy. They can handle temperatures down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, more typically a northern berry. Black raspberries are -10 degrees Fahrenheit, is about as cold as they can stand. There's kind of a line that divides red raspberries from blackberries across the center of Ohio and things. Northern Ohio is red raspberry country. Southern Ohio is black raspberry country. Here in Kentucky, we don't see a lot of red raspberries growing, more black raspberries. Purple raspberries are a cross between the reds and the blacks. Don't really see much of that grown commercially. They're less winter hardy even than the black raspberries. Erect blackberries, Thorny and the thornless varieties can handle about 0 degrees. Semi-erect blackberries can handle 5 degrees roughly. There are differences in different varieties. Some are more or less winter hardy than others, but these are just broad categories of hardiness. And then your trailing blackberries, the Western blackberries, they're not tolerant even to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's one reason we don't typically recommend them. I will say we do have somebody in Kentucky now that's looking at commercial production of blackberries on a rotatable cross-arm trellis. It's a unique production system. The challenges with that, because they're using trailing blackberry varieties, is they have to lay them down and cover them over with floating row covers to try and get them through the winters and things. So there are a lot of different options out there. We have a good fruit industry. We'll mention that also if people are interested in small fruit production, the Kentucky Horticulture Council is providing grants for people to look at commercial production of small fruits. I'll put that in a link here as well at the end of the talk and that, so you can investigate that some more as well. Winter injury is important with our brambles. In the slide here on the left, you can see what winter injury looks like in blackberries. And then on the right, you'll see winter injury to red raspberries. What's unique about the winter injury is you think you've made it through the winter just fine without any significant problems. The canes leaf out and they start to produce well typically, but then what will happen, particularly with blackberries, is once they get a fruit load on, the damaged vascular system within the canes that got damaged by the freeze-thaw cycle, that ruptures and it can't get enough water up to the developing fruit. There's just a high demand for brambles, for water and brambles when they're finally fruiting, and then the canes will collapse and you'll have berries that have set on the canes, but then they just dry up because they can't get enough moisture to them to continue ripening. Kentucky, we are in a unique situation. We're in what's called the transition zone. That's why some of you have Bermuda grass lawns, some of you have fescue lawns. Both will survive here in Kentucky. Neither one thrives, both survive. We're right in that middle where we can do a lot of things, but we also have challenges. We don't get cold and stay cold, and we don't stay warm in our winters like you would if you were in South Carolina or Georgia. This fluctuating temperatures that we deal with, that's what causes a lot of the winter injury there. The moisture will start rising up in the canes. You get a nice day like today. We're 60 degrees over here in Breathitt County. Things are starting to warm up. The soils have been warm for a couple days now, and things want to start growing, but then we're going to drop down cold again, and that moisture can freeze in the canes and cause damage. So that's why one of the reasons why commercial production can be a little bit more challenging in this transition zone. You would think that because we don't get as cold that it would make things easier, but our wide swings in temperatures can cause some problems for us. Again, this just kind of emphasizes you don't always see winter injury until the fruiting laterals begin to grow. This kind of shows cane damage. If you peel off the outer bark, one way you can determine the difference between a primocane and a floricane on your brambles is the new canes when they come up are green, and then as the season progresses and as they go through that winter, the floricanes will develop a brown layer on the outside of the cane, so the floricanes will actually have a brown layer on them. And if you peel back that brown epidermis on your floricanes, in that one picture in the lower right, you can see some brown staining underneath the epidermis, and that's where the vascular system was damaged and the cane was winter injured. Best way to delay winter injury here in Kentucky is delay pruning as long as possible. By mid-March, certainly you want to be done with it because we can quickly go from winter to summer here. But I wouldn't do your winter pruning of your brambles in January in Kentucky. If you were in central Ohio, northern Ohio, you could do winter pruning then in January. Here, certainly I wouldn't look at doing any pruning of your brambles until mid-February at the earliest. Pruning equipment, just need a good pair of loppers or pruning shears. You really don't need a pruning saw unless you've got, some of those blackberry canes can get pretty thick, but a decent pair of loppers can take that off. Again, want to emphasize the importance of buying good quality tools. You know, you want something that's going to last you for many seasons, something that you can sharpen with a nice file and put a good edge on it. Never hurts to just, as you're pruning, you always want to start with your cleanest part of your patch first. If you do know that you've got any diseases in your planting, save the disease area for your planting for last. It's always a good idea, especially on a small planting, it's not a challenge at all. It's just wipe down your pruning equipment with a dilute solution of bleach. Just like a 10% Clorox solution. You can put that in a little bucket and dip your pruning shears and your loppers in that as you go plant to plant to keep from spreading any diseases and things. Or if you got some wipes or something, you can wipe it off that way. Just helps to spread disease, help prevent spreading diseases and things. Regular pruning is necessary. That way you get a good consistent crop. This is really important with red raspberries. Blackberries will grow from a nice crown. Red raspberries will send suckers up down the row and things. And so they're pruned differently than blackberries. And red raspberries can get a very thick hedgerow that really cuts down on air circulation through your planting. So you need to thin that out a little bit so that you can get good airflow and get good berry production as well. I just threw this in here. I wasn't really going to talk a lot about diseases or insects, but this is something that people typically see when they're out pruning. You don't notice it during the summer, you're busy, but crown gall is caused by a soil inhabiting bacteria, Agrobacterium rubii. It's related to the Agrobacterium that they do a lot of genetic engineering and stuff with and things, but it's just forms this ugly cluster of cells at the base of the plant and things, and it will spread through contaminated tools. So if you do see this in your planting, you want to go ahead and dig that plant out so that it doesn't spread. Commercially, there's another strain of Agrobacterium radiobacter, strain 84, that they'll actually make a dip, and they make a slurry and they dip their bramble plantings in the slurry, and that bacterium competes with Agrobacterium rubii and prevents infection. For a home gardener, it's not really economical to do that or anything like that. And once this crown gall is in a plant, you don't cure it. There's no cure. So if you see it, just go ahead and dig that plant out, clean off your shovel when you're done and things, and just don't plant back in that area for a while. When you first, now getting into the pruning specifically, when you first get your plants, if you've ordered plants, they should be arriving sometime mid-April probably is the target date that somebody will be shooting them to you. Or if you go to your local tractor supply center, your Southern States dealer, your Walmarts, I know they have locally here, they have the little boxes of brambles that you can purchase now. For a couple of bucks are on the shelves and that. Those are dormant plants. The dormant plants, you'll have a handle, a stem on there, a dormant stem, and you'll go ahead and cut that back to just a short little stub and plant that in the ground. And then you'll see a new cane arising, a new Primocane arising from that in the spring. If you purchase from some of the larger nurseries like Norse Farms and that, they typically send tissue cultured plants. Those are mature plants. The Primocane is growing. You don't cut that back, that new cane that's on there. But dormant plants, cut back that stem. That removes any diseased tissue and things. It's not going to regrow and produce anything for you this season. So just go ahead and cut back those dormant plants. Tissue culture plants, root cuttings, you don't want to cut those back at all. First thing we're going to talk about are June-bearing red raspberries. If you like red raspberries, and I do, I'm going to emphasize the importance of always trying to get early season varieties of your fruit. Because the spotted winged Drosophila that I mentioned earlier, it's a fruit fly that overwinters. As an adult, they do freeze back during the winter, population declines, but there's some always manage to overwinter. But what we found, Dr. Rick Besson has done a statewide survey looking at when these populations start building up to economically damaging thresholds. And at least here at Quicksand, we can pretty much make it to the first week in July typically before we have to be concerned about pruning any or spraying any of our brambles to control the spotted winged Drosophila. Anything beyond July, we're looking at having to apply insecticides so we don't end up with maggots in our fruit. So I would recommend early versus late. And the June-bearing red raspberries, Reveille is a variety that's out there. It's very early, as you would imagine by the name. That's one that I would recommend. It is a floricane-bearing red raspberry. So what's going to happen with your floricane-bearing red raspberry is Primocane will come up in the spring. You might get a little bit of fruit production off of that Primocane at the top of the cane in the spring, or I mean in the fall. But not much. And so then what's going to happen is that Primocane is going to overwinter through 2021 into 2022. And then in, mid-February into early March, you would go ahead and you'd cut off the tip of those red raspberries like Reveille that are floricane producing. And then you don't want to cut it back too far. Just cut off that first tip, a couple of inches or so, because the majority of the production is going to be in that upper third of the cane. So you don't want to cut off too much, but the tip will probably be winter killed, and it will also have flowered, and those buds up the top won't reflower again. So you cut off a couple of inches, and then you'll also go ahead and go through and thin out some of the canes, because as I said, red raspberries, they shoot up a lot of primocanes in a hedgerow down the row off of suckers, off the root systems. And you want to thin that out, both narrow width. You want to, anywhere from 12 to 24 inches, kind of shoulder width or a little bit narrower. That way you get good airflow through your planting, which helps cut down on disease, remove any dead floricanes from the previous year, because they're not going to bloom again. Remove anything that looks diseased or spindly, something that came up late that didn't grow well, something that might have an insect gall on it. You want to leave about 4 to 5 canes per linear foot in your row. Typically your red raspberries will get anywhere between 4 and 5 foot tall. I've seen people that really want to keep them short so that they don't flop over. But if you do that, you're going to remove the majority of your production. And then in the summer, there's really very little pruning at all that is done with floricane-bearing red raspberries in the summer. You can prune along the edges of your row to try and keep them narrow. Otherwise, you can just wait and do that the following spring. So they're pretty easy to grow. They do produce early in the season. The spotted wing Drosophila shouldn't be too much of a problem for you. But again, if you were thinking about this commercially, talk to your county agent, talk to me before you really invest in this. And as I said, these are more of a northern berry. There's certainly a market for them. People have gotten used to seeing all sorts of fruit in their grocery stores and things, and are more familiar with them now, but they're a more traditional northern fruit, whereas Kentucky is more of a black raspberry climate. There is certainly some market for red raspberries. So June-bearing red raspberries, they produce on the 2-year-old wood primarily, and spotted wing Drosophila shouldn't be too much of a problem, but you want to get the earlier varieties like Reveille for that. Fall-bearing red raspberries, yellow raspberries also produce in the fall. These are also known as the ever-bearing or Primocane-bearing raspberries. I used to really like them. I don't like them so much anymore. The reason that I really used to like them is because the pruning was very simple. The primocanes would come up in the spring. They grow through the summer. As the day length started getting shorter, the floral buds would initiate and you get fruit production in the fall. And then you just come along and mow them off in the fall, or you could wait and do it in the spring. Typically we would do those in the fall though, because that way you get a nice way to control off any insects and diseases and things. Cleaned it up and gave it some time to decay over the winter, and you could get some good production. However, as you can imagine from the name fall bearing raspberries, they come on late in the season, typically mid-August into September. And at that point, you're going to have to be spraying for spotted wing Drosophila. If you don't spray, you're going to have maggot infested berries. For a home gardener, I will put out this little thing that there is an option for you. It's not really economical for an individual, unless you've got some deep pockets and really want to invest. You could buy red raspberries cheaper than you could grow them, but there is some very fine mesh netting called ProTech netting. There's another manufacturer that I can't remember the name of at the moment, but it's very fine mesh, and it basically keeps the spotted wing Drosophila out of the planting. We've got a graduate student in the entomology department that was looking at some research for using ProTech netting on raspberries and things. And what he found is even with his system that he had set up, they were still getting, I think he gave a presentation during the January Fruit and Vegetable Grower Congress. But if I recall properly, I think he said he got about 15% infection in his berries, even using this ProTech netting, because the fruit flies would get underneath when they went in to pick and things. So there was still some infection, which for a home gardener, you might be willing to tolerate a few larvae in your berries, but commercially, larva infested berries would ruin your business right away. It's very expensive. I do remember he said that for just netting their quarter-acre planting, it was $2,500 for netting just to cover quarter-acre planting. So commercially, not really economical. But Certainly if a home gardener wanted to try something like this, I don't know if might be something master gardeners in a county might want to get together and purchase some of this and then cut down a roll for their own use or something, for a short roll or something like that. But large scale purchases of this, it's expensive netting, as you can imagine, because it's very highly engineered to produce it. So that's your fall bearing varieties, really just not recommended. And the fall bearing, the ever bearing ones, they will also produce a spring crop, a Floricane crop the following year. But the ones that have been bred for Primocane bearing production just don't really work well here in Kentucky. They don't produce much of a crop at all. So not really worth doing in my mind. This just kind of gives you an idea what a fall bearing red raspberry planting would look like. As I said, I used to really love them before we had some new challenges. Raspberry trellises, this would be for your spring bearing, Floricane bearing, summer bearing red raspberries. Not very elaborate. Blackberries do require a more sturdy trellis system because blackberries produce more fruit per pound or more fruit per foot than red raspberries do. A simple piece of high tensile wire, or you can even use baling twine I've seen down the edge of a row supported by a 1x4 or something, just to provide a little support so those canes don't flop over, is really all you need for your red raspberries and things. So trellising is very simple for red raspberries. You could get by with something quite simple for your Floricane bearing red raspberries. Black raspberry and purple raspberries, they're tipped. What happens when that Primocane comes up in the spring, we'll see them, you know, May, June into July here in quicksand with the black raspberries. When that gets up to about chest high, you know, anywhere 3 to 4 feet tall, it's still soft and tender on that tip. And you just come along and break that off with your fingers. It'll break off at the right point. What will happen with that is when you break off that tip of your black raspberries, lateral buds will then be released on the Primocane and will send out lateral shoots off of that. Your summer bearing red raspberries are not summer tipped because they don't have those dormant buds that are released like the black raspberries do. This figure here shows tipping them at 2 to 3 feet. That was just an old figure that I pulled out of a production guide, and we don't tip them that short. Certainly no shorter than 3 feet. I like to tip my red raspberry or my black raspberries closer to 3.5 to 4 feet tall, actually. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Purple raspberries, they can also be pinched like the black raspberries if you wanted to produce them, except Royalty. Royalty is a variety of purple raspberry that doesn't send out laterals. And then what happens is in the spring, the Primocane comes up, you tip it. Early summer, the laterals come out, you let those grow all summer long. You ignore them all winter, and then come mid-February into early March, you go out and you will shorten up your laterals on your black raspberries. Shorten them back to probably anywhere from 10 to 18 inches because that's where the majority of the fruit is going to be produced, is on those laterals that come out. Also in the spring, any of the Floricanes that produced the following year, you would go ahead and cut those out as well. Yeah, if you had a small patch, you could go ahead and cut those out earlier in the winter just to make it a little bit easier, because these laterals on your black raspberries, they can easily reach 8 feet long and things without any problem in a good growing year. So sometimes the patch can get kind of woolly, but otherwise, if labor is an issue and timing and that, you can certainly remove all your spent Floricanes and shorten up your laterals on the new Floricanes at one pruning. You also want to prune up any that are too low to the ground. They just collect grass when you're mowing alongside your planting and things. So laterals below, 12, 18 inches, they're not going to produce much. They're shaded too much in that. So That's really all there is to that. Again, anything diseased or broken, go ahead and pull those out as well. Pruning thorny erect blackberries. Thorny erect blackberries, the canes are really stiff enough that you could get by without a trellis on them. I don't really recommend growing them. They tend to produce later in the season. Again, the spotted winged Drosophila can become an issue for them. Also, the thorns are very wicked, and when we have good thornless varieties of blackberries out there, why fight the thorns if you don't have to? Thorny blackberries are tipped. Those Primocanes are tipped that first season about 36 inches. You'll see a few suckers coming off in that, and you can cut those off. Second year, again, if a Prima came up in 2021 and 2022, you go ahead and cut back. There'll be more Primocanes that will come up from a crown that you want to allow to produce. You want to have, 3 to 6, 3 to 5, 3 to 6 canes on a blackberry plant instead of the 8 to 12 canes that you'll get out of a single crown in a year. That just gives you good airflow. It allows the plant to dedicate its resources to producing good fruit and also to producing the new Primocanes. Because you need to remember that with any of these plants like the black raspberries and the blackberries that are growing from a single crown, you've got the Floricanes that are producing in a year, but you also have new Primocanes coming up all around that same year. So it can get kind of thick in there. Again, with the blackberries, they'll send out laterals when you tip them. So you want to shorten those up again because the tips of those will also freeze back and get winter killed. 12 inches, 18 inches, and the lower down ones as well would be removed. So they're handled very similarly to your black raspberries. That's what blackberry flower looks like. Primocane-Fruiting blackberries, they produce a fall crop only. My colleagues at Kentucky State University are evaluating the Primocane-bearing blackberries. Again, they produce late in the season, and if you don't spray them, they're going to be infested with maggots, and you're going to have a bunch of maggoty berries. But the advantage to them is if you do spray them, they can just be mowed off at the ground. So pruning is very simple with those. There's no floricane production of any consequence with those. Prime Jim shown in the picture here is one of the first ones. Prime Jim and Prime Jan were the first ones that Dr. Clark released, named after Jim, can't remember Jim's last name. He was a fruit breeder that trained John Clark, and Jan was his wife. Primocane-Fruiting blackberries would be handled just like ever-bearing red raspberries. Pruning thornless erect and semi-erect blackberries. If you have ordered some of these, which many people do because they're thornless, many of the varieties, two that I would recommend would be Triple Crown or Chester. They're thornless. They're pretty winter hardy, but they are semi-erect varieties. So they do need a trellis system. The first year that you grow them, you're going to think there's something wrong with them because they're going to send their canes just strictly along the ground, and you're going to say, isn't this thing ever going to stand up? Well, it will, but not until the second season. It's just that growth habit they have. So don't freak out when they do that. If you do have a trellis system, you can pick up those canes and wire them up onto the trellis system. Otherwise, you can just let them grow. And then that second year, the Primocanes will then start growing erectly and things. But again, the second season, no fruit production. The first season on the Primocane, they overwinter. The second season, you get fruit production. So remove your low bearing canes, and you don't want things where they're touching the ground. They will actually root, and you can produce more plants that way. Black raspberries will do the same thing as well with the long laterals that come out where they touch the ground. They'll start to root and things. But pretty simple pruning system. You can tip those back if you want, but because they're semi-erect and that, It's not going to stiffen up the canes and they're not going to stand up any taller, but it will cut back how much is trailing on the ground and things and make them easier. Again, some of these canes can easily reach over 6 feet tall and things, and most people's trellis system isn't more than 6 feet tall. So, you know, certainly if it gets up to 5 foot, something like that, go ahead and cut the tip out and you're not going to hurt anything on those. Thornless erect, you know, I haven't grown any of the thornless erect varieties myself, so I can't really speak to them specifically how well they do. This is some work I think that Dr. John Strang did. At one point, they were tipped at 3 foot tall. They removed approximately a third to quarter of the quarter total canes, took out the small diameter canes, and removed the lower laterals and things. Had a 2-wire trellis system. This is pretty standard for a Blackberry system. Commercially, you can see that's a pretty hardy fence post at the end of the row because Blackberries do produce significant amounts of fruit when everything goes well, and you really need a stout system to support your Blackberries. 2-wire system of high tensile wire run between your fence posts, and then the canes are wired or tied onto those high tensile wire. This is another system. This is more elaborate. This is more of a T-type system. Reduces the cane tying, but I think it's easier to tie the canes. You have less capital investment than you do in fence posts and things. And again, this is some more work from what Dr. John Strang did at Kentucky. This was a conventional, they were looking at a conventional pruning system for thornless semi-erect. I think he was working with Triple Crown at the time. So the Primocanes were tipped when they were 1 foot above the top of the trellis, probably a 5 foot tall trellis. So at 6 foot, they were tipped. Any dead fruiting canes that had cropped that fall were removed. In the dormant pruning, they reduced the number of total canes from the crown, removes any spindly canes and the lower laterals, pruned those laterals back to 18 inches. And that's what it looked like once it had been pruned out. And then they were also comparing that to a minimal pruning system where they just kind of let the laterals grow, wrapped them around on the trellis system. And what they found is that the yields per acre, 21,000 pounds per acre with minimal pruning, berry size was smaller. In terms of fruit quality, the soluble solids, they were pretty much similar though. So less pruning involved, so you would save on labor if you were looking at that commercially, but your berries are going to be smaller. So happy to try and take any questions. You know, bramble pruning really isn't that complex. Your Primocane-bearing blackberries, Primocane-bearing red raspberries, also known as fall-bearing or ever-bearing, those are just simply mowed off in the fall. But I don't recommend them simply because of the spotted wing Drosophila issues. Even with your blackberries, you know, Chester, Triple Crown, 2 varieties that I like that would do well here in Kentucky, the season can extend late enough that you can have concerns with spotted wing Drosophila growing in them. So if somebody asked me what brambles I would recommend growing if you really want to limit your concerns with maggot infested berries, I would recommend black raspberries. You could certainly try the purple raspberries as a home gardener. We don't recommend them commercially. Stepping back to black raspberries, I would just grow Jewel. It's a larger berry than Bristol. You're done with production before the spotted wing Drosophila comes on. There are a couple of later varieties, Mac Black being one of them, that you might run into some issues because that doesn't typically finish producing berries for us until right around 4th of July. And as I said, we can start to run into issues with the spotted wing Drosophila first week in July. So early season black raspberries, purple raspberries or your summer red raspberries, your Floricane-bearing red raspberries, those are really the only brambles that I would consider growing myself, unless you really want to have concerns about either having to net or spray for controlling the spotted wing Drosophila. Happy to try and take any questions. As I said, I'll try and put together this presentation, get it printed up as a PDF here. I do want to share just a couple of resources. I can do that. I'll put these in here as well, just for people so that you can see it. Here is a page from the Center for Crop Diversification at UK. We have a whole section on blackberries, marketing, production. Here's a video of Dr. Strang demonstrating blackberry pruning as well. There's a blackberry profile, high tunnel bramble production, organic bramble production. We have the same thing in Spanish, discussions about pests and diseases of blackberries, and smaller scale information as well. And that is right there at the Center for Crop Diversification. It's located in the Horticulture Department at UK. If you just Google Center for Crop Diversification, University of Kentucky, it'll take you right there. So that's one of the resources that I would really recommend that people check out, just for information about diseases, insects, and things like that. Again, the marketing information, this was an older page. We need to go back through and look at that, update our things for costs in terms of sprays and that. This was put together for commercial production and things. So I will stop the sharing of my screen and take questions if people have questions and things, and see what I can answer for you.